Mr. Vampire is a Hong Kong horror martial arts comedy hybrid focusing on the jiangshi, meaning the stiff corpse, which first appeared in Chinese oral storytelling traditions and was later adapted into written poetry, ghost stories, and eventually films. One of the more plausible origins of the mythology could have occurred during the Qing dynasty, where rows of recently deceased bodies were transported on bamboo poles at night. The corpses were lined up like clothes on a rack and carried on the shoulders of two men. The bending bamboo poles created the illusion of the bodies bouncing when people saw them from a distance. Despite being dormant and almost forgotten about, the jiangshi began to reappear in the 1970s through an interesting connection between Eastern and Western traditions. This was in the form of a Shaw Brothers and Hammer Films collaboration, Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, a British adaptation of Chinese mythology which began to draw parallels between the jiangshi and Western vampires. Hopping corpses and variations of it have long been part of Chinese culture and continue to remain in Hong Kong almost half a century after it became a British colony. But despite other films depicting them earlier, Mr. Vampire was the first to properly incorporate and explore indigenous folklore sources, though it still indulged in a fair amount of creative liberties. The film also subtly alludes to the socio-political situation in Hong Kong, particularly by choosing to set the film during the early colonisation period and joking about the British influence on Chinese culture. This is shown in the high tea scene, which is one of the few moments where the Taoist priest loses his usual confident composure because he's never experienced British dining. So much so, he brings his clumsy assistant along to make him look less ignorant. However, they both end up misunderstanding the British customs, and Moon Lee's smug character, Ting Ting, who is wearing an elaborate Western dress, exploits their ignorance by misleading them on the practices, resulting in them failing to hide their disgust for the English food and beverages. This clash of traditional Chinese and modern British values makes up a lot of the film's comic relief. Just like the depiction of vampires incorporates both Eastern and Western characteristics, the film mocks both cultures, but never takes the comparison too seriously. This is indicative of a desire to keep the films as commercially competitive as possible, a phenomenon economist Fujio Mizuoka called contrived laissez-faireism, which allowed the colonial presence to exist almost invisibly by nurturing a cutthroat economic environment where the people saw each other as competition, as a means of distracting them from their colonial masters' oppressive rule. Although Mr. Vampire urges its audience to acknowledge the simultaneous Western and Eastern influences on Hong Kong, particularly leading up to the return to China in '97, it never becomes anything close to serious socio-political criticism. As scholar Jessica Hughes puts it, the conflict of cultures should not be taken any more seriously than the depiction of a Chinese person naively pouring milk onto his Western tart.